The reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty in Israel was a major milestone in the unfolding of God's end times prophetic plan, a sign that the end is near. The recurring conflict in the Middle East is a harbinger of an apocalyptic battle yet to come, the war of Gog and Magog. Our guest today, Dr. Jeffrey Seif, has written a timely book about the role of Iran in this coming war and how this role was foretold thousands of years ago by the prophets of Israel.
Put your hand in mine together. We will walk in harmony. Let me introduce you to my teacher, the rabbi from the Galilee.
You're listening to Messiah Podcast, where Jesus is Jewish, and that changes everything. Messiah Podcast is a production of First Fruits of Zion. Well, welcome back to Messiah Podcast. And you know what? Once in a while, we're honored to have a guest for whom we could spend the entire hour just listing their accomplishments. He's a rabbi, he's a pastor, he's a professor, he's a prolific author. He's got 2 doctorates. You've seen him on TV as the primary presenter for Zola Levitt Ministries, and he's the executive director of the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. Welcome to Messiah Podcast, Dr. Jeffrey Seif.
Glad to be with you.
So, portionally speaking, Messianic Judaism has a lot of scholars. We have a lot of people with doctorates, but you know the movement itself is so small that still there's not that many of you who are working this, you know, from an academic perspective, college professors and so forth, and we treasure every one of you. And so I thought we'd put the spotlight on you here at the beginning and ask, how did you become a Messianic Jew, unless you were born into it? But if you're not, how did you get there? And then how did you attain such heights of scholarship?
Well, I'll begin, by the way, by quoting my doctoral supervisor at Southern Methodist University, Billy Abraham, who died a few years ago, a very good man. He said, "Jeffrey, scholars are what scholars do. Don't be overly impressed. I don't know that I'm any more of a scholar than you, to tell you the truth." But my own story, I was born and raised in a traditional Jewish world, not a Messianic one at all. I didn't know what Messianic Jews were. I come from a post-Holocaust world. I lived in a post-Holocaust Jewish neighborhood, you know, where people had tattoos on their arms. The parents of the kids did that, they were there. So that was kind of my space. And I went to a yeshiva, which is a religious Jewish school when I was young. I begged my dad, however, if I could go to a secular school. I wanted to be like the other kids, the more so. And so I was in yeshiva for the first 6 years, but from kindergarten through 5th grade, 6th grade, I started to go to a public school, and then they sent me to a private school. I didn't do very good in school. I flunked out. I was high all the time. Back then, you know, it's the late 60s, early 70s, and you know, I wasn't interested in religion. I wanted to smoke dope. I was interested in girls. I'm a teenager. I wanted long hair and, you know, counterculture stuff. That was my world. And, you know, I really wasn't very good at school. I ran away from home. I was from Pennsylvania. And in the summer, I hitchhiked to California, in fact, just for the summer. And Christian people would pick me up occasionally. They witnessed to me, you know, talking about Jesus. I didn't want to become a Christian. I said, I'm Jewish. I don't believe in all that. But I appreciated the ride, and they were nice. And sometimes they'd even give me a meal. I appreciated them more than the 1 or 2 gay guys that picked me up and wanted to flip me to take a walk on the wild side. And I had a scary experience 1 or 2 times, to tell you the truth. But I kind of had to push my way out of one situation, which I won't get into. But I get back to Pennsylvania, and, you know, I would go to these rock concerts. You know, I'm a hippie, you know, and these bands are playing, and there's people out front that are passing out pamphlets, be saved, come to church, be born again. And, you know, I'm a hippie. I have hair down to here, you know, and and I'm going to the concert, and someone gives me a piece of literature. They've got a flat top crew cut and a polyester suit. And I remember thinking, I don't really care what they believe. If that's what I have to look like, I'm just not signing up. It just wasn't my thing. I ran into some young guy in Pennsylvania, my age, maybe he was 18 or so, hair down to his waist, and a Jesus freak, a hippie guy that got turned on to Jesus. And came up to me, gave me a pamphlet, wanted to talk to me about Jesus. I said, look, man, I'm Jewish. I don't believe in Jesus. He said, why not? I said, I don't know. We just don't, and his name was Rick. He says, well, do you have any proof that Jesus is not the Messiah? I said, no. He said, do you know what the Bible says about the Messiah? I said, not really. He said, well, would you like to find out? I says, well, maybe I'll check it out one day. He whips out a Bible and starts getting into stuff, and he's kind of pushy, and before you know it, he gets me to pray with him, and bingo, I have some like radical existential encounter where I become a born-again believer, ask the Lord into my heart, and but in my mind then, I didn't join a church. These just young people who hang out in coffee houses and homes and stuff. I didn't think, well, I used to be Jewish, now I've become a Baptist or a Pentecostal. I'm not trying to disrespect Baptists or Pentecostals, but I didn't think I joined them. I just thought that I became a hippie who got turned on to Jesus. Eventually, with time, I felt, when I asked myself the question, what I wanted to do with life, I felt called into the ministry. I was really happy that my life had turned around because of the Lord. I was told I needed to go to college, so I applied to go to Moody Bible Institute because they have a Jewish studies program, and I got rejected. Moody didn't want me. He was a Jewish guy that got saved, and Moody didn't want me. The reason why they didn't want me is because I had to send them my high school transcripts. And, the high school transcripts, everything was D's and F's, maybe one or two C's. And, colleges look at transcripts and they figure how you did perform in the past will be a predictor of how you will perform in the present and in the future. And it wasn't very impressive. So I went to my pastor. I went to a Messianic Jewish congregation at the time. And he said, let's just go beg. So I went in there with him and just begged. And they put me in on academic probation. I wanted to go into Messianic ministry, and I was told, listen, you need to get an education. Before you know it, one thing led to another. I was 27 years old at the time, and I was a janitor. Nothing wrong with being a janitor, but if God's giving you other potential, you're not using it, you ought to use it. So there were no computers back then. I didn't know how to spell worth nothing. And, my first term papers were really a train wreck, and my professors let me know. And I kept working on it, and before you know it, I get an associate degree, a bachelor's degree, 3 master's degrees, and I have 2 doctorates. I'm working on a PhD at Cambridge University now, and I go back and forth. I'll have to be there in a couple of weeks, but I just kind of kept on going. And but I really wasn't on anyone's most likely to succeed list. For me, the real turn on, I think the impetus was when I felt called into Jewish ministries. I thought, boy, this is crazy. Here I want to talk about the Jewishness of Jesus in a world where no one gets that. And here people look at me as a Jew, and I'm too Christian. So there are Jews that don't really consider me very Jewish because I'm too Christian. And there's Christians that don't consider me too Christian because I'm still a Jew. I realized that I'm in this borderland, this no man's land. So I thought, what I want to do is get a good education because I'm going to need the credibility. So you can say I'm wrong in what I say, but I've earned the right to stand up and say it as an academic.
Yeah, I think so. Well, and a PhD. Do you mind if I ask, what are you researching for that PhD?
In Cambridge,
yeah,
it's not in Bible. It's in criminology.
Okay.
I have a master's degree from Cambridge in applied criminology and police management. I'm no longer a police officer, but I was a commander. I've had 2 careers in life. One is a Bible college and seminary professor. Another is a police officer. People say those things don't mix. But I found a way just to do them both.
Wow.
I had a reasonably good work ethic. And so I got accepted into the PhD program, and my dissertation is on ethics. The question is how can we help police to be more kindly disposed toward marginalized persons? That seems to be an issue in culture. And so what I did is I did a preliminary on it. In fact, my master's thesis was on that. I won the top grade of the year at Cambridge.
Nice.
For I did a randomized control trial. I was able to demonstrate that we can, in fact, help people that their impulses are more moderated and more kindly disposed toward marginalized persons. And what happened is the chief scientist at Scotland Yard wrote my recommendation letter to Cambridge to get into the PhD program.
Wow.
And what I did is I used Holocaust studies. That there was a way that I used Holocaust studies. Specifically, it wasn't just a Hitler or Himmler or an Eichmann that killed 6 million Jews. They mobilized local police forces to do it, to round up people. And in fact, before you ever had the industrial machinery in concentration camps in the Ukraine, when the Einsatzgruppen, when the army moved eastward, behind them were these special forces led by police that rounded up and killed 1.3 to 1.8 million Jews, one bullet at a time.
Wow.
And what I did is I looked at police culpability in the Holocaust.
Wow.
And I kind of dug out that story visually. And the question was, would exposing people to that, would exposing police cadets to that prompt them to think, well, wait a minute, boy, look what those cops did back then. You know, did it prompt them to a little more examination to put bias in check toward marginalized persons? And I was able to show that it did.
That's fascinating.
And so I'm working that out now on my on a randomized control trial for my PhD.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading about that. I mean, that to top your previous study is going to be difficult, but I'm sure you'll do it. That's you mentioned that maybe the two careers people don't think they go together, but what a beautiful way to think of Jewish ethics and a Judeo-Christian biblical ethical paradigm, and to apply. You could put it anywhere. You could look at anything through that lens, police included, right?
The last person who told me that was the head of the criminology program and police management at Cambridge University. Part of the process of getting accepted there is you have to go through an interview. You send them your application. They send you something to read. You write back, and then they do an interview. And the last question in the interview, Dr. Sherman said, Jeffrey, what in your previous doctoral research do you think can contribute to what you're doing right now in criminology? And I said, absolutely nothing. I do not think there is anything because that's religion, that's Bible, and I don't think that's going to have any bearing. And he told me I was wrong.
Fascinating. What a fascinating topic for research. I hope you get a book deal out of that, because I would totally read it. So to switch gears a little bit, you've done quite a bit in your life, and one of the things you're doing right now is you're the executive director of the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, the UMJC. And we love the UMJC here at First Fruits of Zion. And, we've written biographies of these Messianic Jewish luminaries, these pioneers like, Daniel Zion and Avram Polyak, who in the 50s were dreaming of this sort of a Messianic Jewish congregational movement. And today the UMJC, according to the website, represents 75 congregations in 8 countries. So I guess give us an overview of the UMJC. How did we get here, and what is the UMJC all about?
Yeah, well, on the quick, talk about information. We're adding 21 communities. We're staring at 100. But how did we get where we are? Jewish people came to faith, and a lot were comfortable to assimilate in Christian churches. Some wanted to discover their Jewish heritage, the more so, and explore what it meant to live it out. People would say, someone like me, how long have you been a converted Jew? I'd say I'm a converted sinner. I'm not a converted Jew, which no sin to be a Jew. Well, what does it mean to live life communally in a Jewish world, to have a foot in the Jewish world and a foot in the Jesus world? And the congregational movement got a lift because women and men were game to ask that question. Not just people of Jewish extract like myself, but non-Jewish friends who fell in love with the Jewish people, the Jewish Messiah, the Jewish homeland. Similarly, wanted to participate in a community experience that was more decidedly Hebraic than not. And so with all of that, a few organizations were birthed in recent decades, one of which, the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, which most recently, I was elected the executive director and am pleased to represent.
Wow. So you mentioned the friends of the Jewish people who are hungry for a Messianic Jewish perspective. And I think you've described a lot of our listeners. I've been to some Messianic Jewish congregations, not as many as some people might assume, because I sort of live out in the middle of nowhere, but I've been to a few, and they sort of run the gamut from a very church-like or church-adjacent experience to basically like an Orthodox synagogue. And when I say church-like, I mean like an evangelical church or a Pentecostal church. Does the UMJC represent this full spectrum of experiences?
I think so. But to your point, yes. Let's say if you go to the Messianic communities in Israel, and there are many, you'd think you're going to a non-denominational service, but it just so happens to be in Hebrew. Whereas, and in America, some of the communities are like that. Others are more like a traditional synagogue, but they so happen to refer to Yeshua, to Jesus. So there's a gamut there, to be sure.
Cool. So yeah, I guess people will have to just show up and see what it's like. It's hard to know what to expect.
Yeah, the union is less inclined to regulate what people do. In my world, it's not as imperative to work within the parameters of traditional conservative or Orthodox Judaism. I'm a little more reformed in that regard. I'm a little more assimilated. I'm a little more enmeshed in the culture than distinct from it in decidedly Hebraic space. So my mind is like that, and my wife as well. Now, both of us come from traditional Jewish families. I went to a yeshiva as a youngster, which is a religious Jewish school. So I know what it is to wear the kippah all the time and the tzitzit and to be involved there. But I'm a little more liberal in all of that.
Okay. And I think that probably the variety is present among the Jewish people as a whole, and you're going to see it in Messianic Judaism as well. People from all different backgrounds and at all different levels of observance. It's a microcosm.
Yeah, and I don't want to be controlling. I don't want to be that kind of human being. There's variance in human experience. Viva la différence. I'm not interested in policing the way that we worship. I don't live in that kind of space personally. I object to it. Don't want to be controlling.
That's probably a good philosophy for the executive director of such an eclectic group of people. Sort of a live and let live, yeah.
Someone asked Golda Meir what it was like to be the prime minister of a few million Jews. She said it's like being the prime minister of a few million prime ministers. So there's no point really even in trying to, tell everybody what to do. So.
Yeah. Well, and there's a long tradition in Judaism of, it's the local rabbi. Ask your local rabbi and he's going to, there's not some overarching Sanhedrin. There will be, we think, but there isn't now. So I want to shift gears here a little bit because I would say, to get a little personal, the person primarily responsible for my parents and by extension my first contact with a Messianic Jewish perspective was Zola Levitt. We had VHS tapes of Zola Levitt explaining Christ in the Passover Seder, that kind of stuff. And how did you come to take over for Zola Levitt? And were those difficult shoes to fill?
Well, I had worked with Zola for a number of years, and then I left and took a professorship. And I was kind of like a behind-the-scenes guy for him, helping prepare the intellectual payload for the television programs, and then doing other things as well, representing the ministry. But I left to become a professor. And when he was sick, he said, let's get Jeff back in here. So I went and did 5 years and then left for a bit and then came back and did 5 years. A year ago, I finished my last series on that 5-year bit. So I have 10 years total. What was it like? Well, Zola was a pioneer, like you said. He was, as Christian television was coming into its own, he certainly with the name Zola and the last name Levitt and the face, and then taking people to Israel and shooting on location in Israel wearing Hebraic kind of garb, he was an anomaly. Plus, he was a down-to-earth, folksy kind of guy. I'm a little colder, a little more intellectual, perhaps the university professor, but people fell in love with him. And when he went on, it was an honor to be able to step in there, to get called in to do it. But you got to be your own person. But it's hard to walk behind a legend. I've always said that, you can have a founder of a congregation, First Baptist Church, Reverend so-and-so found it, and everybody loved him and his family and everything. And he goes on. Usually the guy who comes in right after gets slaughtered because invariably people compare that person to Reverend so-and-so, and they're not. I never tried to be a cheap imitation of Zola Levitt. I thought I'd just be a first-rate me. And I try really to be authentic to who I am when I do what I do, and people were gracious to receive me. But it was quite the honor. And like you said, that he really, in so many ways, was the best of us and a front runner. And I count it one of life's privileges to have been able to walk behind him.
I imagine. So I want to talk about your book because it's incredibly timely, more timely now maybe than when it was written. The book is The Iranian Menace in Jewish History and Prophecy. And it was reprinted this year for such a time as this. Israel's been at war before, but this feels different to me. I mean, does it feel different to you this time?
I'm not very in touch with my feelings. I'm just so stunned. I don't know how to rate the magnitude.
Yeah.
It's a 10-point scale. I'm already at 10, and it doesn't vacillate a whole lot between the ongoing situation in Israel in October of last year, and then rocket attacks, and then virulent anti-Semitism at the campuses in America. And as a professor, that hits me. I'm fried like a piece of bacon already. And so I don't know if it's any more, but I just don't know what to make of it. I'm just stunned personally.
Yeah. Well, I've only read about past conflicts and even things like the Second Intifada. I was too young to really understand what was going on. But I don't remember this anti-Israel, anti-Semitic backlash happening back then like it is now. It seems like something's changed, right?
I think so. I can't say exactly what it is. Sometimes you have doctor in front of your name. People think you know. It's just best to say you don't know.
Well, my next question was, is this the final escalation up to the war of Gog and Magog? So maybe that's the answer.
Yeah, I'm personally not tethered to eschatological commitments. And part of that is because I've seen individuals that claim to know and wrote books on the subject. The books aren't worth the paper they're written on, 10 years later. And I've seen a few iterations of that, so I'm less inclined. But for me, the Iranian menace was really the best I could project, being true to myself, that speaks to foreign about what we're looking at. 15 years ago, our television program interviewed Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, and he said, listen, Iran is the number one existential threat. Everyone who was anyone was saying it. And, I was interested because when I looked at ancient literature, which I kind of get into to a certain extent in the Iranian menace, ancient Jewish writers kind of brought Iran to the fore. It was Parthea in Yeshua's day, Iran today. And even the word Iran is a relatively new name that they changed the name. Hitler comes to power, and Iran is connected to Aryan. It was to speak of the association, the genetic commitment, the philosophical commitment, where Iran became Iran, derived out of Aryan, much the same.
Wow.
But for me, I was interested in just looking at Iran in ancient literature, and I was just fascinated personally that if you look at ancient Jewish literature, beyond the pale of biblical literature, individuals saw trouble coming from just east of the Euphrates. And that's where Iran is. When I look at Revelation, for that matter, the Armageddon War is precipitated by forces east of the Euphrates coming into the region, and then the Battle of Armageddon. So to me, I just thought there's some stuff worth looking at.
It's interesting to me. This stuff has been there in Jewish literature. Some of this stuff it's thousands of years old. We have Old Testament prophets. We have the pseudepigraphal literature from like the intertestamental period and the New Testament period talking about this. But imagining it happening, it hasn't made sense so much until quite recently. Like it's hard to imagine this scenario actually playing out until this sort of narrow window of time that we're living in now. Like there would be no, without Jewish people in the land of Israel, how long has this been a realistic possibility, I guess is sort of my question.
Well, I'll answer that to your point. I think Israel's emergence as a nation state against all odds isn't just fortuitous, it's providential. So you have that, and of course that stirs up forces round about. But Iran itself isn't even like one of the 22 Arab neighbor countries. Iranians aren't even Arabs. It's kind of far to the east. So certainly Israel's emergence is significant. And if you look at biblical literature, in Ezekiel, Israel emerges as a nation state, which invokes the ire of people round about. And Persia is mentioned explicitly as at the vanguard of leading an assault against this fledgling state to nip it in the bud. So you find that in biblical literature. I don't know that we find precedents in history, but we do now. We live at a time today where Israel has emerged as a nation state against all odds. And you do have this Iranian intrigue and all of this bellicosity, all of this anger, this fermenting discontent. And maybe it's not just a coincidence. You know, individuals that want to look at Bible prophecy think there's something to it. And, there seems to be something to it.
Yeah. Now, this hasn't even always been the case. Wasn't Iran, for a while, they were okay, or they were on board with the state of Israel. Is that correct?
Well, Iran was okay with Jews.
Oh.
Jews had lived in Iran and live in Iran to this day, but everyone who is anyone kind of got out of Dodge. Zionism, the nation state, is adjudged to be offensive. So that's what stirs it up. And then there's, from my understanding, eschatological commitments within their brand of Islam that looks for some last days war and to be at the tip of the spear of that, to bring in prophecy as they understand it. I think it's the nation state that stirred it up more than anything, more than just Jewish presence. Because actually, Jews had migrated to Islamic countries and fared well for centuries. In fact, Jews would count themselves fortunate if they lived in Islamic countries more than Christian countries. Jews had problems in Christian countries, be they Catholic or Protestant, irrespective of the variety. There isn't a single country in Europe where Jews have not been thrown out of. It's been miserable. Jews were able to live at peace as subjects in Islamic civilizations. Israel's emergence, however, kind of changed the relationship, and then Jews were fleeing Islamic countries.
I've thought about this a little bit because I have that, the map of all the countries and all the years that the countries in Europe expelled the Jews, while at the same time, Jews had a better situation in the Middle East and in Moorish Spain.
Yes.
And I thought, isn't it strange that to compare the fortunes of those two land masses at that time, because you have this Islamic golden age where they're discovering, the circulatory system and whatever, where in Europe, they're just not doing so hot. We have the Dark Ages, right? So I don't know, maybe there's a connection there.
Well, Islam had a commitment to education. As Islam expanded, it translated all the scientific and philosophical works of conquered people into Arabic. Even as Islam expanded into Israel, when it left the Arabian Peninsula, the Hebrew language was in shambles. If you look at biblical Hebrew today, the vowel pointings, they're all Arabic. The Islamic grammar was so well developed. Islam was known for scholarship. And if you look at, as to your point about the Golden Age on the Iberian Peninsula, under Al-Rahman, the Caliph, he gathered all of the scholars he could in Cordova. He had a caliphate there that rivaled Baghdad. The best scholars in the world. In fact, the Golden Age of Jewish theology and philosophy developed then with Maimonides. It comes out of the Iberian Peninsula. It comes out of Spain. By way of contradistinction, if you go into Europe, north, where the church had control, the church controlled the sciences. The church says, listen, the earth is flat. Well, the earth is flat. The church says everything revolves around the earth. And then if you contradict it, then you have the Inquisition. So you have people coming up with telescopes and saying, no, wait a minute, it looks like we're all revolving around the sun. No. You contradict the preferred narrative and you get in trouble. So Europe had very little intellectual development. It wasn't until the Crusades when the Europeans go invade the Holy Land and they realize, the Muslims have higher walls, bigger building, bigger domes. That's better engineering. That's better math. These people are much more developed in art and science and literature. So when they come back from the Crusades, alas, in Europe, the Renaissance, the Reformation, all of a sudden there's this new openness to broader knowledge. And that was because Islam had it and European Christian society lagged behind. And part of the reason why they have it, you could argue, is Jews were able to flourish intellectually, all things considered. And so you have Jewish scholarship that's contributing to it. Arguably, even the cartographers, the map makers and others to explore the New World, Columbus and what have you, fare from Jewish extract or minimally from Jewish influence out of intellectual Spain.
Fascinating. Talking about the Crusades, there is this repetitive pattern that you point out in your book, where you have the major geopolitical situation of Eurasia. You have Rome versus Parthea, or you have East versus West, and Israel is just right there in the middle. Can you talk about that a little bit? How the ancient situation in which these, all the prophets that you talk about in your book and the extra biblical literature, how that's mirrored today in today's geopolitical situation?
Yeah, well, I think it's fascinating. If you look at the modern nation state of Israel, it's the only land bridge connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe. And it's right there at that intersection. Jews have been persecuted. God, choose someone else. Or the promised land, couldn't you have promised us something else, someplace else? I mean, it's just. So the truth is any army, people are given to warring, bellicosity. Nations want to expand. And you have a civilization in North Africa, when they push eastward, they're going through Israel. If you have an Asian civilization that's pushing westward, they're going through Israel. If you have an Arabian civilization that's pushing northward, they're going through Israel. If you have a European civilization, it's like it's the crossroads of civilizations. It's fascinating, but it's challenging. What do you do? It's hard to live securely in a place like that.
For sure. So I came from a conservative evangelical background, and my homeschool curriculum was fundamentalist. So it took me a while once I started going to college to realize why it might be a good idea to read texts that are not in the Bible. And a lot of the texts that you reference are extra biblical, amazing, fascinating Jewish eschatological texts. But maybe you can give a word or two to our listeners who may have come from a similar background to myself. What has been the value of this extra biblical literature to you, and not just to you, but to countless other exegetes, as far as helping us understand the Bible?
Well, it helps us understand the way people were thinking, first of all. It gives us a window. There's an old saying, the long arm of the pen reaches beyond the grave. So if you're looking at intertestamental literature, you have the Old Testament, you have the New Testament, there's space in between. That's called the silent years. Well, it's silent insofar as the penning of biblical literature, but it's not silent in the fact that there's no literature being presented. And it lets you know the way that people were thinking, how they interpreted biblical texts, how they understood the world. It gives you folk history. It gives you intertestamental history. It gives you a window into how they construed. And I think it's very important. If you look at New Testament literature, you're hearing voice and does cultivating an appreciation for the way other people spoke and thought. Can that contribute to understanding what we're seeing in the New Testament? I think the answer to that question is yes. Just simply put, for example, if you look at these synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you look at the pedagogical methodology, if you look at the way Jesus, the way Yeshua communicates, he uses parable. He's a storyteller. When you look at rabbinic literature, ancient literature, if you look at the way they communicated, it's storytelling. Not only that, if you look at Jewish storytelling, it's farming, it's fishing, it's banquet scenes. It's using the same kind of visual vocabulary. And even the statements, for instance, if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, it closes with Yeshua on record. He who hears these words of mine and does them is like a wise person who builds their house upon a rock, and the floods come, and this, and it stands. Conversely, who hears these words of mine and doesn't do them is like someone who builds on the sand, and the floods come, and it all falls apart. Now, we're used to that from Yeshua, but Jesus is borrowing a Hebraic expression. He who hears the words of the Torah and does them is like a wise person who builds their house upon a rock. He who hears the words of the Torah and doesn't do them, there's a sense in which Yeshua is tweaking pre-existing Jewish idiom and giving it an application. And the value of understanding ancient Jewish literature is it gives a kind of clarity to what Yeshua is up to. But we can hear him as a sage in his own world. And it's interesting that one of the great scholars on the Jewish background of Jesus' teaching was David Flusser, a late professor at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, who wrote The Sage from Galilee and other works akin to that, where he looks at Jesus as a Jewish scholar. In any case, to the point about extra-biblical literature, that pseudepigraphical literature is not canonical in the sense of the New Testament and the Old Testament, but it's helpful because it gives a window into the way people think.
I want to riff on what you said there about Jesus being a sage among his own people, being like a rabbi, right? Being a Jewish teacher of Judaism, because we bang on that drum all the time here. I mean, it's one of the ones we like to hit the most. When I talk to Christians about this who haven't heard of this yet, I'm reminded of the sort of the canonical narrative of interpreting the Gospels historically within Christianity, which is that you have Jesus and the disciples who are the good guys, and then you have the Jews, or the Pharisees and the Sadducees who are the bad guys. And for years I've told people, look, it's the Jesus and the Pharisees were very close as far as their ideology and what they believed, and the sort of fighting that you find there is like infighting, right? It's not, they're not existential enemies. And when Christians see Rome, they're sort of part of the scenery. Like the Rome's just there, and it's inevitable, and it's a historical fact bearing down. Whereas I try to get them to understand, Rome was the hated enemy and the oppressor, and the Romans killed Jesus and all of this. And it's sort of an NT Wright, Christ and Caesar sort of a thing, not quite. But one of the ideas that you bring in your book is an even broader view, which is to look east and say, okay, Rome taking Judea as a colony is not ideal. But then over here you have Parthea. Like, what was going on with Parthea? Who were these Parthians, and do they represent like a greater threat even than Rome to like the existence of the Jewish people in that time?
Well, let me get to it, but let me back up to something, a point that you just made that kind of harks to the previous point about the value of intertestamental literature. If you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are written from about 150 BC to, let's say, if you look at the community at Qumran, till in the 60s AD, and you read the way they speak about the Jewish religious authorities, they're critical, they lambast. It sounds very much like the critique that you get out of Yeshua. Now, you're not going to accuse them of being anti-Semitic or anti-Judaic. They're just going after an issue. So one of the benefits of looking at the broader literature of the period is it gives you a context for the inner communal tension with Jewish religious authorities and the followers of Yeshua. And it doesn't put the critique of Yeshua, it doesn't make him or his followers anti-Semitic any more than the priests at Qumran are anti-Semitic, and they're not. But to your point, in century 1, Parthea was deemed as the principal threat, certainly to the Romans, because they have bad history. The Marcus Licinius Crassus Dives, called Crassus, He personally funded legions to go and conquer Parthea, which would be modern Iran. Part of it is because Julius Caesar conquered the Gauls, and Pompey had success in Asia, and all that Crassus had done was conquer a slave revolt, and he wanted to prove he had game. And he was extremely wealthy, so he's going to lead an ill-fated expedition eastward that's going to get annihilated by the Parthians. And they're going to deal Rome a significant defeat, embarrassingly. In fact, there were so many soldiers that were killed and so many were taken captive that the price of male slaves in the East dropped in the slave market because there was a glut of Roman soldiers up for sale. So,
wow.
To be sure, the Romans hated Parthia. In fact, Pompey was in Syria negotiating to bring Antioch and Syria into the Roman fold because they wanted to hedge against Parthia to the east. And when Rome is there negotiating to bring Syria in, it negotiates to bring Judea in as well as a Roman holding explicitly at the time. Principally, it wanted to have a firewall against Parthian intrusion. They saw the Iranians, they saw the Parthians as a nemesis, as their number one rival. In fact, Judea had a procurator, Pontius Pilate, to superintend their affairs. Up in Syria, out of Antioch, they had a legate, which was someone of senatorial rank, of a higher rank.
Oh, wow.
And they had a number of legions stationed in Antioch. It was the gateway to the east, and it was all about fortifying against a Parthian intrigue. So from a Roman perspective, Parthia was the end of the world. The Romans saw the world that they had conquered as civilized, and those just outside of it were barbarians. And Parthia was a barbarian land. All that's at play.
It seems similar to today. You have the European politicians will describe Europe as this walled garden of civilization. And then, as soon as you get past Israel, it's the barbarians at the gates.
I mean, the word barbarian means non-Greek. So it literally means those that aren't of us, of our ilk. But to your point, yes, but this might be a kind of thing that people like me and you run into because we like to look at the Bible from a Jewish perspective. Theology has been very Eurocentric. All of the scholarship and the theologians, European trained, European vision, value, and virtue. And there's a sense in which reaching beyond that into Semitic texts and perspective, it's kind of outside of the fold, and we kind of got a little pushback for that reason.
So, I've looked online to see what people say about Iran. There's a lot of people out there saying there's just nothing to worry about. 30% of them are living in poverty, and there's an opioid epidemic apparently, and they talk a lot of bluster, but there's just no threat there. It's a paper tiger. What do you have to say to those people?
Academics don't understand religion because they're irreligious. The power that mobilizes inner constitutions. It makes no sense to an agnostic or an atheist or someone who's incredibly liberal why someone should earn a living and put $10 in a collection plate. It's a waste of money. There's trouble understanding the kind of passions that resonate within that are mobilized by religious convictions. Iran is not simply a secular state. One could argue the previous administration was, but the current one, it's driven by a religious ideology, and it's extremely powerful. A lot of times people that are secular, they just don't understand that. And it's because they don't understand the mobilizing power of religion.
Well, one thing I love about your book is that toward the end, you sort of devotionally or pastorally talk about what the master has actually directed us to do specifically, whether it's the first century or today, as we watch the world sort of fall into war and chaos or whatever's going to happen. What should we be doing? How should we be living?
Well, if you're going to talk about Bible prophecy, you can't ignore the book of Revelation. And so what I wanted to do was do it in a way that would make sense to me. Because, a lot of times these fanciful constructions on the book of Revelation really just do not comport with my sensibilities. When I look at the book of Revelation itself, there's a world that descends into chaos, disorientation, despair, wickedness raises its hoary head. At the very end, the Messiah comes and gets the better of the evil forces and establishes his kingdom. That scenario is perfectly congruent with the way Jewish people see history's endgame. It's the way religious Jews work through the prophets, Ezekiel, Zechariah, and others, and understand biblical history. When I look at Revelation itself, it uses not just the overarching narrative of the traditional Jewish perspective on a history's endgame, but even the apocalyptic language itself. The idiom that it breathes is very much akin to the apocalyptic language that's used in Jewish sources that I note in the book. But with that said, it's still a bit abstract. What I wanted to do was look at the book of Revelation. It's called the Revelation of Jesus. Now, what's interesting about the book of Revelation, first of all, is it's about as clear as mud, so it begs the question, what's being revealed? What I wanted to do was look at what Yeshua, what Jesus actually said in the book of Revelation. If one understands the book of Revelation to be giving voice to maintaining your faith in a world that's very wobbly, what for me was certain about what Yeshua is saying is exactly what he said. There's moral exhortations there to keep the garments white, to be faithful. And what I wanted to do was explore those simple, clear statements of Yeshua in the book of Revelation, because that is the revelation of Yeshua in the book of Revelation.
Yeah, and I love that you came away with that you sort of ended the book by saying, look, these are the things we should be doing, and not just trying to gin up as much hatred in our hearts as we can for, Muslims or Arabs or Persians or anything like that, right?
No, for me, it's a core value. I want to define myself by what I'm for, not by what I'm against. And I don't hate any Arab person or any Muslim person. And, as intense as I am, if I would have come out of a Muslim woman's womb and born in a refugee camp, I might be a freedom fighter myself at the end of the day. I don't want to make light of any of that. Now, with that said, I have a history as a police officer as well, that I have, I'm not afraid to use deadly force to defend home and earth. But it's nothing personal. It's not born out of any disdain for anyone. It's just there needs to be some maintenance of civilization. To me, it disturbs me, since you raised the point, that some people that love the Jewish people, they love Israel, they think that it's meritorious to hate Arab peoples or hate Muslims. And that just doesn't comport with my sensibilities at all. I don't think that we're really allowed to hate anybody. And I just don't want to be associated with haters. I know one Messianic Jewish leader who once said the only good Arab was a dead Arab. I just thought that was one of the worst things I'd ever heard in my life. In fact, in my congregation, we just moved into Dallas, and there was a candidate for Dallas sheriff who was a Muslim and the assistant imam in his mosque.
Wow.
And he came after the service. I asked him to come. I knew him anyways as a cop. He used to work for me when I used to superintend the police academy. After the service, the announcement, he came just to extend a greeting. And I was so pleased to have him there. Someone came up to me afterwards. It was a Friday night, and complained, how can you let some Muslim defile the space by letting them come in there? And I told the person, you can't be at war with everyone. Don't you want to try and find ways you can make peace? And by the way, the night that he came was on October the 6th. The hellbreak was the very next day, as you know. And anyways, for me, there's lots of problems in this world. I want to be part of the cure. And I wrote another book, by the way, Making Our Peace with the Warriors of the Sand. And I wanted to look at everything in the Bible that's positive about our estranged Arab cousins. Everything in there that speaks to or about them in a friendly light. What I wanted to do was explore that. And I got in a little trouble for doing that, because some people think you just got to hate Muslims. But, I got better things to do personally than hate anyone. It's not the way I roll.
Yeah. I feel the same way. Shortly after October 7th, A few hours west of here in Chicago, there was a landlord that went into his tenants and just stabbed them to death because they were Palestinians. And I thought, man, they didn't do October 7th. They're in Chicago, dude. Like, it just broke my heart. I think that there's, what we should be doing is following Jesus' directions for how to live our lives. And you know what? Some of the people I've met that I respect the most, and I can't say their names for obvious reasons, are missionaries to Muslims. Because isn't it just a mission field, another mission field?
I'm speaking in the next 2 weeks to a missions organization that's all about building bridges to Muslims. And not only bringing the message to them, but Indonesia, bringing resources to create businesses. By the way, not all Muslim people are terrorists, not all Palestinian people are terrorists. At Georgetown University, they did a massive field study with 1 million respondents of Muslims in the Muslim world, and they wanted to know, the political bent toward Israel, etc. The good news, I think, was that only 7% were really kind of strident in opposition, virulent opposers. 93%, they didn't have those discontented impulses. The good news, it's only 7%. The bad news is there's so many Muslim people, 7% still amounts to over 100 million people spread out worldwide.
Yeah.
But a lot of that is closer, by the way, and this might speak to Bible prophecy too. A lot of that discontent is closer to Israel, the further away you get from it. You might have a Muslim that will pay lip service to, get back Israel, but they don't live in that space. It's not really within their constellation of concerns like it would be someone who lives in Egypt or Jordan or Lebanon or Syria.
Yeah. Well, the book is The Iranian Menace in Jewish History and Prophecy. You can pick it up anywhere books are sold. And Dr. Jeffrey Seif, it's been just such an honor to have you here on the podcast today. Thanks for coming on.
It's a pleasure to be with you. And by the way, I and we at the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations support First Fruits of Zion. We love you and your ministry.
Well, we love you guys too. Thanks for your vote of confidence. Well, thanks for joining us today on Messiah Podcast. If you're interested in learning more about the Jewish Jesus, check out First Fruits of Zion at ffoz.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening. Messiah Podcast is made possible by the generosity of our First Fruits of Zion friends. FFOZ friends are people like you who support our mission and get loads of exclusive Bible commentary, teaching, and content. You can join today at ffoz.org. Tune in next time for more great conversations. Until then, I'm Jacob Franzak. Shalom.
Let his word cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea. Let his love cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea.